Nadia and her brother Tomas each inherited $60,000 from their grandmother in the same month. Nadia, nervous about investing a large sum right before what might turn out to be a market downturn, decided to ease in carefully, splitting the money into 12 equal monthly deposits over the following year. A strategy she'd read was the safer, more responsible choice. Tomas, less anxious about the timing, invested his entire $60,000 in a diversified index fund the same week he received it and never touched it again. 10 years later, Tomas's account was worth roughly $28,000 more than Nadia's, despite both starting with the identical amount, investing in the identical fund, and neither one making a single additional trade over the following decade. This result surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it, because easing in gradually feels like the obviously more cautious, more responsible choice, the kind of advice that shows up constantly whenever someone receives an inheritance, a bonus, or the proceeds from selling a house. Vanguard's own research comparing lump sum investing to spreading the same amount out over 6 or 12 months has found that investing the full amount immediately outperforms the gradual approach in roughly 2 out of every 3 historical periods studied, across multiple decades and multiple market conditions. The gradual approach isn't a bad strategy exactly, it's simply the less mathematically favorable one in most circumstances, for a reason that becomes obvious once you look at it directly rather than through the lens of what feels emotionally safer. The mechanism comes down to a simple fact about how markets behave over time that gradual investing works against. Markets rise considerably more often than they fall, over any sufficiently long historical stretch. Because of that basic tendency, money sitting in cash while being slowly drip-fed into the market is, on average, missing out on more up months than it's avoiding down months, simply because up months occur more frequently. Nadia's uninvested portion, sitting in cash for months 11 and 12 of her gradual plan, for example, wasn't protected from a downturn that never came. It was simply sitting out of a market that continued rising during exactly the months it was still parked on the sidelines. Tomas's $60,000, invested entirely and immediately, was exposed to the full 10 years of compounding from day one. Nadia's final monthly deposit, by contrast, only had 9 years and 1 month to compound, and her second-to-last deposit only 9 years and 2 months, and so on backward through her 12-month schedule. Averaged across her entire drip-feeding period, a meaningful portion of her $60,000 lost roughly 6 months of compounding time, compared to Tomas's version of the identical money, a gap that, spread across an entire decade of an 8% average annual return, is precisely where most of the $28,000 difference came from. None of this means gradual investing is a mistake in every circumstance, and dismissing it entirely misses something important about why so many people choose it in the first place. The real value of easing into the market isn't mathematical. It's psychological, and for a specific type of investor, that psychological value can matter more than the statistical edge lump sum investing typically carries. Someone who would genuinely panic and pull all their money out during a downturn that happened to arrive shortly after investing a large lump sum is arguably better off choosing the gradual approach, not because the math favors it, but because the math on lump sum investing only works if the investor actually stays invested through the inevitable volatility that follows. And a strategy that keeps someone calm enough to avoid panic selling can outperform a mathematically superior strategy that someone abandons in month 3 out of fear. This is the part of the comparison that gets lost when the conversation stays purely theoretical. A person who invests a lump sum immediately, watches the market drop 12% in the first 2 months, and sells everything in a panic, locking in a real loss, ends up considerably worse off than someone who eased in gradually and stayed the course for the full decade. The statistical edge of lump sum investing assumes the investor behaves identically to the disciplined, hands-off approach in both scenarios, an assumption that doesn't hold for everyone, and understanding your own likely behavior under stress matters more than which approach wins on a spreadsheet in a vacuum. Nadia, for her part, has never fully regretted her decision, even after learning the numbers years later. She describes the 12-month gradual approach as the only version of investing that large sum that would have let her sleep at night at the time. And she's honest that a version of herself who invested the full amount immediately and then watched a downturn arrive in month 2 might well have sold in a panic and ended up considerably worse off than the $28,000 gap actually suggests. The genuinely useful question then isn't simply which strategy wins historically, since the answer to that, in most periods, is lump sum investing by a meaningful margin. The more useful question is an honest one about your own likely behavior. Would seeing your full investment exposed to a sudden downturn cause you to panic and sell, undoing any statistical advantage entirely? Or would you be able to leave it alone regardless of what the market did in the following months? For an investor who can genuinely answer the second way, the data points clearly toward investing a lump sum immediately rather than easing in. Tomas never framed his decision as brave or unusually confident. He simply didn't think much about the timing at all, invested the money, and moved on with his week. Nadia framed her decision as the responsible, careful choice, and by the emotional standard she was optimizing for, it likely was the right one for her. 10 years later, one sibling had $28,000 more than the other, produced entirely by a difference in comfort with uncertainty rather than any difference in financial knowledge, discipline, or the amount either of them had inherited in the first place. The lesson is not that everyone should always invest a lump sum immediately. The lesson is understanding the trade-off between mathematical advantage and emotional comfort. The best investment strategy is often the one you can actually follow for decades. A perfect strategy abandoned during a market crash is worse than a slightly imperfect strategy followed consistently. Successful investing is not only about knowing the numbers, it is about knowing yourself well enough to make decisions you can live with. Nadia and Tomas started with the same money, but their different choices created different financial futures.